Good morning, everybody. I'm Yoram Peri, the K-Chair for Israel Studies and the Gildenhorn and the Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. I welcome you all here. I'm sure that in half an hour it will be packed. The students are still asleep, so we send some people to wake them up. But the panel is already here, so we can start. Just a few words about the Institute. We started it about 3-4 years ago, and by now it's the fast-growing Institute for Israel Studies, or fast-growing program for Israel Studies in the country. This year we are having 500 students who take 15 courses on different topics of Israel: politics, history, society, culture, the conflict. We're involved with research as well. You can see some of the products of our research on our site. We are publishing the Israel Studies Review. You can see the copies over there. Don't just watch them, sign, subscribe to the journal, which is a very good new journal. I can tell you because I edit it. And we do some other things as well. We don't look at Israel from a narrow lens, but a wider perspective, trying to look into comparative issues, global issues, and regional issues as well. And today is one of these examples of that wider perspective. Because nowhere in the world is Mao Zedong's dictum that political power grows out of the barrel of the gun truer than in the Middle East. The armed forces have been the basis of power in the Arabic-speaking world and Turkey. That's why the nationalist authoritarian regimes and traditional monarchies, which had seen so many coup attempts in the 50s and the 60s, had to find special ways to control the armed forces. They did so by special privileges, close intelligence watches, promoting officers on basis of loyalty to the regime, and many other measures. One of these was the creation of elite parallel military formations. Examples include the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Iraqi Republican Guard, the Saudi White Army, and others. The hegemonic power of the military brought some conservative scholars to undermine the Arab Spring. One of them wrote, and I want to quote him, "During the Arab Spring, there has not been a single revolution in the usual sense of the word. In Egypt and Tunisia, what we are seeing are essentially coups. The armed forces both used the mass demonstrations and responded to them by seizing power. In Libya, a rebel army was basically handed power by NATO. But where the army remains loyal, as in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so far, but perhaps shakily, Syria, the regime remains in power. In this situation," I continue the quote, "neither revolution nor elections or revolutionary Islamist groups really matter. The soldiers are still the boss. Change, then, is more illusionary than real." End of quote. I'm reading this quotation not because I subscribe to the analysis. I think it is wrong to undermine the authenticity of that democratic outburst, the genuine desire to establish a just society, the courage of hundreds of thousands of young people who endangered their lives in the public squares of Tunisia, Egypt, and in these very days, Syria. I doubt whether these events were mere fake military coup. Yet many questions should be asked. What is the role of the military in these states, a year into the Arab awakening? And what will be the position of the armed forces in the coming years? Will the militaries give up easily their privileges? And what kind of relations will they have with the Islamist movements? Could Turkey be the role model for a transformation of these armies' forces in the region, particularly in Egypt? These are some of the questions that we will discuss today. And there are very many questions, and therefore we have chosen only 5 states. We could have taken more states, but in that case we had to start at 7 o'clock in the morning, not 9 o'clock in the morning. These 5 states really represent a wide spectrum of possibilities, from direct control to indirect control of the military, from military regime to liberal democracy with an instrumentalist army. But before, I will not pursue the analysis of that, because I want to give the stage to Dr. Bonnie Thornton-Dill, the Dean of our College of Arts and Humanities, to deliver her welcoming remarks. Let me say a few words about her. Bonnie Thornton-Dill assumed the position of Dean in the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland in August 2011. Prior to Dean, she served as Women's Studies Department for 2 decades as professor and chair for 8 years. She is also the founding director of both the Center for Research on Women at the University of Memphis and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. She is currently president of the National Women's Studies Association and also serves as chair of the advisory board of scholars of Ms. magazine. Internationally known for a cross-cutting scholarship on race and gender, Black and Latina women in higher education, as well as issues such as work, family, and poverty. Dr. Dill has led women's studies in Maryland to national prominence. It is one of the select few universities in the United States to offer a doctoral degree in the field. It serves as a base for the National Women's Studies Association and editorial home of the pioneering journal Feminist Studies. So we have more and more journals in the university here. Her scholarship includes numerous articles and 3 books, most recently Emerging Intersections, Race, Class, and Gender in Theory, Policy, and Practice. Professor Dill is recognized as an outstanding teacher and mentor, having received prestigious awards, and now we all can really benefit, and I have to add my personal feeling as well, not only benefit, but enjoy having her in her new position as Dean. Professor Dill, please.
Thank you, Yoram, and good morning. On behalf of the College of Arts and Humanities, I want to welcome you all to this exciting panel today, and particularly our guests from other campuses. The Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies is really, as Yoram said, becoming one of the premier institutions for Israel studies in the United States. It's housed in the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies, and it really approaches these issues Yoram talked about in a broader frame. And I think one of the things that makes it so outstanding is that it focuses not just on issues of conflict per se or politics per se, but really puts them in context, and in the context of history and culture and community, and really tries to give a broad perspective to the issues that are occurring not just in Israel, but in Israel as a part of the Middle East. And that's why I think this particular forum is so important. It follows up on a wonderful event yesterday that focused on America's stakes in the changing Middle East. And I think it exemplifies even more the way in which this campus is becoming a resource for studies of the Middle East and for studies of the whole region and the ways in which Israel figures in that region and the ways in which its history and its interests can develop and change that region. So I think this is a really important conference. I'm very pleased and proud as Dean to be able to have this as part of our college and to have it contributing to our college in many vital and important ways. I'm also very pleased to acknowledge the Gildenhorns who are here today. In support, not just providing their name as support, but their bodies as well. Ambassador and Mrs. Gildenhorn, we thank you for being here. So my remarks really are very brief, but I really just wanted to confirm and talk about the importance of the work that the Gildenhorn Institute is doing, not just for its own programming, but for the campus as a whole and for the college, in really bringing these vital issues to the forefront. So again, I thank you all. I'll let you get to the business of the morning, and I thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. So we'll start right away with the first panel that is going to discuss the cases of Turkey, Jordan, and Syria, and will be chaired by our good friend Shibley Telhami, whom I think does not need really any introduction. Everybody knows him here, and if you didn't know him until last night, you could see his fantastic event last night. Shibley Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and he is well known for his very many other activities in the field of the Middle East, in particular the public opinion polls that he's doing in the region. And yesterday he published another one, which is fascinating. I hope we'll be able to hear about that as well today, Shibley. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to chair this panel with good friends. Before I introduce them briefly, I also want to say that the university has been really fortunate to bring on board Yoram, Peri, and I think Alma and Joe Gildenhorn have to be proud with how much has been accomplished in such a brief period. It's been a great asset for the university, and this has become an institute that has voice on campus, and it has been varied and open and created links across the programs, just like it was designed to do, and we're really grateful to have you, Yoram. You've been a great asset to the university. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists. These are all good friends that I've known for many years, and I know that you've known them because many of you have read their works, or you've seen them on television, or you've read their columns over the years. But I will just say briefly something about their current positions and their work. I'll start with my friend Henri Barkey, who is one of the leading experts in this country on Turkish foreign policy, a leading scholar of international relations. He's the Bernard L. and Bertha F. Cohen Professor at Lehigh University. He has published and edited at least 5 books, a lot of it on Turkish foreign policy and the role of Turkey in the region. He is also very active in the public policy arena, has written multiple articles in the major press, has served in the State Department on a couple of occasions. His voice is always listened to on matters related to Turkey, and we're really glad to have him today to shed some light on the issue of the day. I should add that this is an extraordinarily important issue, and I commend Yoram for thinking of it, because as you watch not just the Arab awakening that's sweeping the Middle East, but really many of the core issues that are facing the United States in the Middle East, including Israeli decisions pertaining to Iran and including what's happening in Iran, it's very hard to understand what is taking place in these countries and how decisions are made without understanding the critical role of the militaries in almost every case. And you see even in the outcome of the Arab awakening, what happened in Tunis and what happened in Egypt really had in the first place to do with decisions made by the militaries. And you see the critical question pertaining what is likely to happen in Syria is going to be about the loyalty of the effectiveness of the military. And in Israel, as Yoram has written about in the past, work that is highly cited on the role of the military in Israel, you can understand that a lot of the decision-making is seen through the prism of the military establishment, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad, in a distorting way. And we clearly have to understand this issue. Following Henri, my good friend Jillian Schwedler will be speaking. I just want to say a couple of things about Jillian. Jillian is currently Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but she's just accepted a position as a full professor at Hunter University, at Hunter College in New York City, where she has been residing, and she has maintained a house, so she's going to, in a way, be more fully united with her family in New York. I have to tell you, not only is our congratulations due, it's well-deserved promotion, but it's been very rapid by academic standards, and we have an investment in Jillian anyway, not only as an expert on the Middle East and politics of the Middle East, and particularly the role of religious parties in the Middle East. Jillian, when she came out of graduate school, she was the first hire we did in the department. I chaired the search to bring her on board to our campus while she was finishing her PhD at NYU, and that was before 9/11. We thought that we needed to understand the role of the Islamic parties in Arab politics. It wasn't a very hot issue yet in the discourse, and boom, she arrives here, and 9/11 hits, and it becomes a hot issue. And she did an incredible job on campus, not only in supporting the students and being a great colleague and being productive in writing, but also in filling the gap of the public discourse that with all the demands, and was really fabulous. And she finished her book, Faith and Moderation, Islamic Parties in Jordan and Yemen, which was an important book and highly cited. And so it's been we were sorry to miss her. She turned down tenure at Maryland to go to Amherst for personal reasons, and I'm glad actually she's going to be a little closer in New York because we can get her out here, I think, more easily. So it's really good to have you, Jillian, back at Maryland, and always good to see you. Let me turn to David Schenker, who I've known since his early days at the Washington Institute when he was first a fellow prior to his joining the Department of Defense to work on the Levant issue in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and then came back to the Washington Institute, and he's currently the Aufzien Fellow and Director of the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute, writes a lot. He wrote a couple of books for the Washington Institute, and he's also very prolific in writing in the public media, and it's good to have you, David. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll start in that order with Henri. If you can keep your opening remarks to 10 to 15 minutes, that would be great, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Henri.
Thank you, Shibley, and thank you for the University of Maryland and the Institute for Israel Studies for inviting me. Since I have 15 minutes, I have to talk quickly, and I'm glad maybe the students are not here since they are not awake yet. But let me say that it's very interesting. If those of us who worked on Turkey for a long time would never have thought that I would not be speaking about the demise of the Turkish military, which for so many years controlled and dominated the Turkish political system thoroughly. And the collapse of the Turkish military came rather quickly. And sometimes it reminds me a little bit of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was there, and then suddenly, poof, it was gone. And this is the same thing that happened to the military. And in fact, if you look at the military today in Turkey, it's no longer an actor. Nobody really cares what they think. Something like 139 acting and retired officers, including a former chief of staff, are in jail being prosecuted. Touching the military it used to be, the military was sacrosanct. Whatever they said was correct, and you couldn't veer from the line. And yet this change happened very rapidly. And what I will try to do very quickly is first say a few things about the system as it existed, and then look at the causes for its collapse, and then maybe see what, if I have time, what lessons we can derive from from this experience. I mean, just to telescope the conclusion is the Turkish system is not what you want to emulate in the Arab world, that's for sure, unless you want to look at the collapse. But so what was the system? The system, you know, people have talked about it as a guardianship system, as the tutelage system, whereby the military did not always was not always on the forefront, but was certainly in the background, deciding things, leading the politicians, and intervening whenever it felt it had to intervene. And you see, starting in 1960, a whole series of military coups, 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997, and each one was different. Each one was quite unique in character. But in fact, it was a 1960 coup, as I will argue a little bit later, was really the critical one, the one that essentially legitimized military intervention in Turkish politics. And the kind of system they created, and the Turkish system was democratic. There were elections, as my good friend Stephen Cook, who's here in a wonderful book, he talked about pseudo-democracies, where the military, whether it's in Egypt, Algeria, or Turkey, essentially allowed for some semblance, of course, in each country was different, some semblance of political activity, but they would be in the background because they allowed for the politicians to satisfy certain desires in society, and then the military would not get its hands dirty. But the Turkish military system was more than just interfering in domestic and foreign affairs. It was really an ideological system, and its strength and its core was ideology. It was there to defend an ideology that it had essentially created in many ways. And this ideology, the Kemalist ideology, or after the founder of the state, Kemal Atatürk, and they eventually, they kind of tried to formulate some kind of a consistent or coherent ideology, and then eventually even came up with this set of courses in universities and in schools, what they call the Atatürkist thought system, as if there wasn't identifiable. It was very nebulous, but it was basically founded on essentially on nationalism and secularism. And it was really designed to protect the system from two fears: Islamic fundamentalism or Islamicism and Kurdish nationalism. But in the process, what they did was to create essentially a system that was quite arbitrary. They created their own institutions, but at the same time, they also made linkages with different groups in society. So this was not a military that was always using essentially the bayonet to stay in power or to be influential. It had enormous amount of support within certain segments of society, within the bureaucracy, within the media, within the academia, and Turkey is probably the only country I know in the world where academics can don their nice black robes and go out on the street and say, military, please coup. Please overthrow the government. I mean, this is the only, I think if you tell academics in America that this is what the Turkish academics like to do, they were shocked. But so there was a great deal of support. And the one most important group I forgot was the judiciary. And the judiciary and the military worked in tandem, so that if you went against the dominant ideology, you could essentially be prosecuted. And freedom of thought, freedom of real freedoms, as we understand it, really did not exist. This doesn't mean that there was not opposition. There was always opposition to the military, except that it was not powerful enough. It could not be heard, primarily because of the way the media operated. But in reality, the Turkish public loves its military, thinks very highly of its military, but never liked the military's interference in politics. And in fact, there was a great deal of evidence to that effect. Every time the military intervened in politics in one way or the other, the first elections afterwards, the voters essentially punished those parties or those politicians who sided with the military. In 1960, they overthrew an elected government, executed 3 of its leaders, including the prime minister, imposed a new system. The first 3 elections that you had after 1960 coup, the 1965 elections, the party that was associated with the executed prime minister won a sweeping victory. In 1971, they intervened. The one politician who stood up to them happened to be a social democrat. He got rewarded in 1973 elections. 1980, they intervened. A new politician emerged. The military created a 2-party system, very much like in Brazil, the Yes Party and the Yes Sir Party. The night before the elections, the junta leader came on television and said, you're going to vote for these 2 parties, and people massively voted against those 2 parties. 1997, they intervened. They overthrew in a post-mortem coup, i.e. without using force. They intervened. The first 3 elections after that in 2002, the party that essentially, the offshoot of the party that had been pushed out, won. And the most critical and the deciding battle, if you want, between the public and the military was in 2007. In 2007, there was a question of the Justice and Development Party, the mildly Islamist party is in power, and they wanted to elect Foreign Minister Gül as president. The military went and issued an ultimatum through the internet, at least in modern now, and then basically saying, you're not going to do this. The government decided to call their bluff, called elections, and the elections was fought only about this issue, and they lost massively. The AKP, which had won 34% of the vote in 2002, in 2007 increased its share of the vote from 34 to 47%, an amazing increase. And so that, if there is a date at which you realize that power shifted away from the military, that was in 2007. So how do we explain this? There are 3 essentially sets of explanations, or I'm sorry, 3 explanations that can be offered. One has to do with the way the military's involvement in politics degraded politics and undermined the development of the Turkish political system. And in the process, also undermined the one party that could have been a social democratic alternative to what we have now in Turkey, the Republican People's Party, by essentially associating it with it. In other words, the main opposition party today, the Republican People's Party, is so closely associated with the state and the military that it has lost credibility in the eyes of the public, but moreover, this political party, for most of its existence from the 1960s onwards, essentially assumed that it had to be in power because it had the backing of the military. It became lazy, it became the kind of the official party of the military, and in the process, it stopped functioning as a real political party, opening up essentially the political spectrum to the Islamists that should we say, mildly Islamist parties that we have. Essentially, the first explanation has to do with the degradation of the Turkish political system, and the fact that whenever you have politicians became lazy. That is to say, they knew that if they messed up, the military would come in and clean up after them. So you didn't have essentially a responsibility. You call it, if you want, moral hazard in some respect. And so in that sense, it undermined the political system. But the second, and I think more important reason, is the strategic and the tactical mistakes that the military made. The strategic mistake is not to understand that what I suggested earlier, that the Turkish public loves its military, and if you looked at poll after poll, the military always came on top as the most respected institution. But the military essentially should have also looked maybe at University of Michigan Values Project, where you look at, they do polling all over the world, and the military comes on top in many, many, many countries, and sometimes even higher than the Turks. I mean, even in Spain, the military is seen, I think, higher. So, but the Turkish military and the media that fed this same mantra that the military is the most respected institution, and therefore the military, what the military says is obviously correct. So they believe their own propaganda. And they, in the same time, they imposed a system that was very inflexible. Officers, unlike politicians, are not necessarily well known for being able to make compromises. I mean, it reminds me of Truman, who said about Eisenhower when he became president, poor Reich, he's going to come in, he's going to think it's like the military where you give an order and everybody will say, will salute. That's how the military operates. That's not what how politicians operate. But the military essentially created a very restrictive system, especially on certain issues like Islam and the Kurdish question, which both festered continuously. But so in terms of the big strategic mistake is that, as I said, every time they intervene, the public pushed back, they missed that. But they also made what I call tactical mistakes, but really undermined their credibility with the public. A lot had to do with the war against the Kurds and the PKK in the southeast. They engaged in horrible repression, but at the same time, they had support among the bulk of the Turkish public, but they thought that they could get away with anything they wanted. And I'll give you two little examples that in some ways really destroyed their credibility. One was an incident in which 4 soldiers died because supposedly there was an accident, a training accident. Well, somebody leaked that, in fact, this was not an accident. A soldier had fallen asleep during guard duty, and his commanding officer, in order to punish him, called him in the next day and gave him a hand grenade, pulled the pin and gave him a live hand grenade. And this kid, 18-year-old kid with a live hand grenade, started going around, and the damn thing blew up and killed 3 other soldiers with him, right? This became, and they had to admit that they had lied. It goes back to Nixon, it's a cover-up, right? It's always a cover-up that undermines you. The second incident is there was an armored personnel carrier blew up over a mine. The generals essentially said, the PKK did it. They came, we tracked them. They put the mine, and then they left. They went back to Iraq. Well, it turned out, again, somebody leaked it. It turned out that I'll be done. It turned out that the mine had been put by another unit of the Turkish military. Again, they lied and they got caught. These essentially undermine the most fundamental aspect of the military, is that you send your kids to the military because you expect them to come back and not be killed because of the mistakes. So that undermines confidence. The third is essentially, and I'll go over this very quickly, is a changing nature of Turkish society. The transformation of the Turkish economy meant that it's much more robust. There's a much more important conservative and pious middle class that is now richer, that is willing to contest political space, and it also happens to be backing the AKP. Plus, the information age has made it impossible for the military to control. So, what is that to learn, and what are some of the issues? Now, the military, there are actually very interesting similarities between the old military system in Turkey and in Egypt. I mean, they both thought they had unrivaled credibility. There was lack of transparency. Nobody could look at their budgets. Nobody could question them. They both had a significant economic role in society. The Egyptian military, as you know, has, and Steve will probably talk about this, manufactured refrigerators. Apparently, they make the little ice cubes in form of tanks, maybe, I don't know. The Turks have a mutual fund, a retirement fund. They both have amazing prerogatives in terms of jobs after retirement, exclusive compounds. They both ruled behind politicians, but there are also significant differences. I mean, the Turkish system, it was far more ideological. The Turkish system had a Western alliance, it was part of NATO, so it had essentially a certain amount of cover from that. The Turkish military has not been really involved in, except if you look at the civil war, in major conflicts since the Cyprus invasion, which was minor. And the Turkish system was in many ways much freer and had much more of a history of contestation. So there are significant differences, but in many ways the Turkish system was not democratic and was not, in the end, undermine itself. And so in that sense, maybe the Egyptian and Turkish militaries were quite similar. And let me stop here.
Thanks very much. Jillian.
Thank you very much. I want to start with a few comments about how I came to this topic, how I came to be interested in the military, because I didn't start off as someone who specialized in the military or in civil military relations. In 1997, I was interviewing some residents of the town of Karak to the south of Amman, and the town had been under curfew after a protest a few months earlier. And a number of the people I was talking to told me that when the riot police had set the curfew, after a few days they were replaced by the army. And when the army came in, they were throwing flowers at the army and singing songs and dancing. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I started thinking about the role of the military and the role of the army and when it intervened in politics. And so the project I was working on that I'm finishing up now was a study of protests well before the Arab Spring, but looking at the ways in which protests are in fact not exceptional and disruptive, but kind of a normal part of politics in Jordan. And so the role, the intervention of different security services into protests and policing protests became of interest to me. Another similar story I heard was in Man, which was about the Israelification of the riot police. And that story was that the IDF was training the riot police, which is why the riot police were going in and ripping food out of cupboards and destroying people's homes and just leaving everything in disarray. What's of interest to me is not whether that story is true, but that story is circulating, that there's a perception that the army is coming in as a defender of the nation, where the riot police were very much disruptive of people's lives. And so for me, that was part of my starting point. Looking at politics and seeing where the army or different security branches emerge as part of that picture, as opposed to studying the military and being an expert on the military per se, and asking when does it intervene in politics. So it's a slightly different starting point, but I think it fits perfectly with the theme of this conference today. So just a bit of background, Jordan is of course not a military regime, but the regime has relied heavily on the army as a pillar of support since independence. Historically, the army has been a strong defender of the regime in a number of instances. There was an attempted coup in 1958 by an army officer, but that was put down, and some of the troops, the Bedouin troops under that officer, actually revolted against the officer in support of the regime. And so there's a strong, loyal aspect of the army to the regime. It has a reputation for being well-trained and highly professional, despite being relatively small in size compared to some neighbors. I'll leave out the little historical background of different instances. But to say, Jordan's army is technically under civilian control, but in reality it's under royal control. The Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces reports directly to the King, not to the Minister of Defense, not to the Prime Minister. Conscription was in place until 1992 when it was suspended. It was reintroduced in 2007 in a more limited capacity, with service lasting as a few months, and it's described to me more as a means of job training and kind of a national civil service rather than a 2 to 3 year required service. The ranks of the army are no longer predominantly Bedouin, although Bedouin continue to be clustered strategically for security purposes, particularly around Royal Guard and Special Forces. But the end of conscription has prevented the automatic filing of Palestinians into the military, and the army is now predominantly East Bank in origin, although not exclusively. And it's seen as a pillar of regime support and a pillar of the West Bank community. Palestinians, which by most counts are a majority of the population, are largely seen to be involved more in the business community, private sector. Those are broad, sweeping characterizations. Of course, there's divergences from those. But the general perception is that the army is East Bank and loyal to the regime, and the Palestinians are in the private sector and the business class. King Abdullah is very proud of his career and talks about it very much as a commander of special forces. He trained at Sandhurst. And around the country, you see these many faces of King Abdullah images. So you have military Abdullah, family guy Abdullah, businessman Abdullah, tribal Abdullah. So you have his different faces, but you see the uniform on quite frequently. And so I think that's important while the army is under civilian control, that he still nods towards that. The army has not played a heavy-handed role in keeping domestic order in recent decades. It has a few times in the past. More related to domestic dissent, and particularly protest. You see the Public Security Directorate, the PSD, or the Amin al-Am, the General Police. The Riot Police branch of the PSD, which doesn't function as strongly anymore. The Mukhabarat, of course. And since a few years ago, 2008, the Derek, or Gendarmerie, is the new professionalized riot police, which is very present in the city. There's created very interesting tensions with the creation of the Derek forces because they report directly to the Ministry of the Interior and not through the PSD and then to the Ministry of the Interior. So PSD officers are unhappy with it and complain to me about it. So I think that's an interesting tension. But the army has been not present predominantly on the streets. The tensions happen around these other security agencies in policing protests, with the exception of when there are long-standing curfews, and then you have to have the army will come in to replace the various other security forces. And that's when as I said, I've heard numerous stories of people being much more grateful and seeing the army as defender of the nation as opposed to these sort of belligerent, aggressive forces domestically. In Amman, you do see army presence outside some embassies, but it's really the Derek that are more ominous forces. They're visible acts of repression. They're seen as the most visible agency of repression domestically. They're at every single protest. They're down in the protest. They're often off in the back with their tanks, but they're also seen as highly professional. So with regard to the Arab Spring, and particularly the role of the military in Jordan, with all uprisings and particularly revolutions, the major question is, do you see defections in the military? And in Jordan, absolutely not. There's no looming issue on the horizon with regard to that. Protesters are not, however, calling for an end to the regime. They're calling for a variety of things: electoral changes, a directly elected prime minister or a prime minister elected by the deputies who are elected, an elected Senate, changes to the Constitution that curbs the king's power, particularly a stripping of amendments of the Constitution since 1952 to go back to the 1952 Constitution, which has a slightly reduced powers for the king. So I'm not going to give a comprehensive overview of the events in Jordan because my focus here is on the military, but I want to summarize just a few events and then talk specifically about the military. Protests have been steady over the course of the year. There have been a lot more protests than you probably realize. There have been hundreds of labor strikes. There have been a lot of events in the South. You're seeing tribal protests. You're seeing all the familiar protests as well, professional associations, political parties, etc. But you're seeing a lot that's happened, but it hasn't escalated as it has elsewhere. The monarchy is not immediately threatened, and so we haven't seen the army have to emerge to play this strong, visible role. And again, the Derek and the other security forces, particularly the Derek, have been most present in putting down the protests. However, King Abdullah was and is, I think, rightfully concerned. He's tried to get ahead of the process. He's responded quickly, even if familiarly, by sacking the prime minister twice, calling for national dialogue. This is very familiar in Jordan, but this is very much what's happened. However, there have been some move to some real reforms, and I'm not going to go into those in details. But the king is trying to get ahead of it. But the army, because the regime itself isn't threatened, you haven't seen the army come in as a major presence, and there aren't these questions of whether the military is going to split or not. So what has been the political role of the military? I think it's useful in the most recent years to look back to the spring of 2010, when a group of retired military officers directly criticized the regime in an open letter, and this was seen as extremely provocative. Their accusations were directed at King Abdullah, and they were that he was forgetting the regime's social base, and he was not looking after them. He was failing to curb corruption, which was seen as rampant, and he was selling out Jordan, or selling Jordan, to a new Palestinian technocratic business elite. And this business elite were very much these urban cosmopolitans, not the traditional economic elite. Queen Rania and the royal family were seen very much as implicated in this problem. And the regime was banking on this new Jordan, this new project, a new economically open Jordan. And these retired army officers, as well as a number of other forces, were seeing that this project for New Jordan was leaving behind the traditional support bases of the regime. And they were making it very clear to the king that they were aware of this and they were very unhappy about it. The letter was unprecedented from these officers. Since then, we've seen a number of arrests of prominent individuals for corruption, and we've seen the withdrawal of the Queen and her family from prominent business deals. And so there has been some response to that. But the letter was part of a broader trend, not only about retired military officers taking a political role, but it echoed the regime's traditional support bases, which are these prominent East Bank families and Bedouins, but the issue were more the prominent East Bank families who were feeling very alienated since King Hussein's death. In 2000, and they complained that King Abdullah doesn't come visit them. He sends emissaries. He sends the Minister of Tribal Affairs. Most recently, in the past few months, King Abdullah has begun to visit tribal, important families more regularly to try to mend this. He's got the message, I believe. But I think the army, the police, and all the security services are all, very tightly aligned behind the regime. They've made clear that they expect the regime to defend them. But I think that in looking at who has been protesting, it's been predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly East Bank voices. You haven't seen a massive Palestinian mobilization. I think if you did see a massive Palestinian mobilization, some of the East Bank voices would stop protesting because they have an interest in supporting the regime because the regime is preserving their social base. They're just making sure at this point that the king is getting that message. That they expect him to play this role. Given the predominantly East Bank makeup of the army, it's not surprising to see it fall in line with other East Bank social forces, for example, in pressuring the regime to return funding to its civil service and provide more direct subsidies and services rather than channel efforts into neoliberal policies that appear to be benefiting Palestinian private sector and harming the regime's traditional support base. Thinking about the military, and when I talk to a lot of protesters, one of the things they point to is that Jordan is surrounded by instability. So you have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Syria to the north, of course, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia is even seen as a problem, not because the regime is unstable, but because of Jordan's own very small but growing Salafi presence. And so that's seen as in some ways being exported from Saudi Arabia. And in this, the army is seen as fiercely loyal, but across the political spectrum, I don't hear any views that the army is seen as not defending the nation. The army is seen as part of the solution in a lot of ways. Other security forces are seen as more corrupt and part of the problem. And so I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much. David.
Thanks. It's somewhat daunting to be giving a talk on political role of the military with so many knowledgeable people, both on the panel and the next panel. I mean, for goodness sakes, Ken Pollack actually wrote the book on Arabs in the military, so I'll be cautious in my remarks. In talking about the political role of the military in Syria, we could have a very short talk. The answer is it's a politicized military. The rest is just commentary, so we'll go from there. By way of background, historically this was an army in Syria that was built for political reasons. It was built as a small army by the French, staffed primarily by minorities like Christians, Alawites, Druze, and Kurds, the Sunnis, which are the vast majority, 75% of the people who live in Syria, were discouraged from participating, primarily because the military is viewed as a tool of control of the civilian population. Following the Syrian participation in the 1948 war, which was limited and not particularly effective, you had a series of coups d'etats that essentially further politicized the military in Syria. In particular, a coup in 1949 set the pattern going forward for the next decade and a half or so. And the Army Corps actually became overwhelmingly Sunni at that point. In 1963, you had once again the minorities took control with a coup that was led by a guy named Salah Jadid and Hafiz Assad. Following this, hundreds of Nasserite officers, mostly urban Sunni upper and middle class officers, were purged. When Assad took over in the military in 1970, it was never really an option after that point for an apolitical military. It was a divided, disorganized ideological and political entity moving forward. Initially, in the early years of the Ba'ath, the military and the party essentially were indistinguishable, with Assad heading the military and Salah Jadid heading the party. Jadid attempted to control the state and the military through the party. Assad instead worked to consolidate his power through the military and to separate the party in a way from the military. The army today remains very politicized, opposed to reform, above the law, corruption permitted if not encouraged. The army initially opposed the consolidation of Assad's rule, but it was soon brought to heel. And essentially, since then, Assad has used the military not as a protector of the state, but as a protector of the regime. And the best example of that, perhaps, aside from today, of course, came in 1970s. The Alawite elite units, the Republican Guards, commando teams, were not deployed in 1973 against Israel. They weren't parachuted behind enemy lines to take on Israeli tank formations or armor in the Golan. They were kept behind to protect the regime. And as a result, Syria lost some 800 tanks in the first 24 hours of the 1973 war. In 1982, you had continued purges of the military for political reasons. Essentially, Assad purged some 400 senior officers who opposed, in 1976, who opposed the Syrian military intervention in Lebanon. The politicization of the security apparatus, military and state security, continues to this day. You have 4 security directorates in the country: military intelligence, Air Force, intelligence, state security, and political security. The heads of military intelligence and Air Force intelligence, the most important of these branches, are headed by Alawites. State security and the political security, the sort of interface on the daily basis, traditionally with the Syrian people, have been led by Sunni officers, most likely to diffuse sectarian tensions. I don't know if I have to remind everybody, but the vast majority of Syrians who are Sunni, and in many, throughout the Middle East, I think many Sunni Muslims view the Alawites as heterodox, if not infidels. So the Sunnis are the chief interface with the regime. These 4 security directors are answerable to an Alawite, though, a general named Hisham Ikhtiyar, who reports directly to Assad. There's a lot of ways of looking at how the military interacts with the population, with politics, with the rest of society. Some of the sort of most in favor way of looking at it these days is through networks. So you have essentially the relationship between politicians and, by extension, the military, and capitalists, basically what's referred to often as a Sunni business elite. It's traditionally been a relationship relationship that's governed by distrust. It's a relationship between essentially a rural minoritarian leadership and a Sunni majoritarian business community. The cooperation has been through informal economic networks between state officials, military officials, and private actors. The political elite and the military, the regime, is concerned about the cost of this cooperation, but they, in addition to having to subdue the larger population and get buy-in, they needed the private capital that this community could offer. So it has essentially emerged as an alliance between the regime and the Sunni business community and what we'll call new economic elites, which are essentially former state officials who are now involved in private business, state officials and military officials. Back in 1970, Assad knew that he couldn't, quote-unquote, Alawize the elite and maintain the exclusion of the suburban, urban Sunni middle class, so he had to accommodate them. harness their economic potential, and co-opt them to nullify the threat. There's a great new book out by a guy named Bassem Haddad called Business Networks in Syria, where he discusses the ties between the regime and the business community. It's pretty dense. It's a short book, but somewhat difficult to get through, but very academic, if I might say. But the long and short is you have this sort of private sector business elite and business actors within the political elite, which includes the top leadership of the military, the security apparatus, and you have the top generals and their deputies and their children, and the security apparatus chiefs and their children, who work essentially through partners. They are silent partners with the Sunni business elite to acquire substantial wealth. And in return, this is I don't want to go back to the Godfather, analogy that's used so frequently, but let's say that in this sort of mafia-type relationship that these elites within the regime act as protectors of the businessmen. And this is what's happening between the military and the regime and the wider population. So you have a triangle, basically the elite, the bureaucracy, the regime, and the sources of capital. Essentially, today, Syria is what is often referred to, mostly in the context of Turkey, as the deep state, where you have this coalition of military, security, intelligence, and criminal elements who are opposed to liberalization. And I'll add to that the part of the Sunni business elite. So what do we have today, looking beyond these sort of networks? Well, you have the Syrian military with some 300,000 troops, some 30 to 40 brigades that Assad can use to crush this domestic uprising. He's already deployed some 80% of the units that can be operated there. The key unit for Assad is the 4th Division, which is all Alawite. After all, and that's about 10 to 12,000 people. We can differ or discuss that further, but because obviously, while most of the officers in the military are Alawite, the conscripts, the trigger pullers, as it were, are Sunnis. So Assad has to employ these Alawite units mostly to go after and crush this largely Sunni uprising. It's an inherent problem to ask Sunnis to go out and shoot Sunnis. You can think about what happened during the revolution in Egypt, for example, right? Now, Hosni Mubarak is now on trial for giving the order to state security to kill 800 people. He may be convicted, he may not be convicted. I don't have any doubt that he would have given the order to the military to go out and shoot people if he thought the military could actually give this order and have it followed. Right? The military wouldn't have done it. Turkey, likewise, in many ways, I think there's some similarities about the political position of Turkey vis-a-vis the revolt in Syria. Right? Erdogan, the premier of Turkey, would go on vacation with Assad and his wife. Right? They're very close. Erdogan was, I think, loath to condemn Assad, but for a Sunni Islamist, essentially Muslim Brotherhood regime in Turkey, it became untenable not to condemn the mass murder of Sunni Muslims by an infidel, essentially. So you've had 10,000 dead, mostly Sunni Muslims in Syria right now, which has led to an increasingly rapid pace of defections from this largely Sunni military. Essentially, Sunni Muslims are abandoning their units and taking their weapons with them to join the Free Syria Army. Now, sort of reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But this is basically a band of defectors and people at the local level who are defending their community with their private shotguns. So far, the best we can tell, there are some 43 battalions of Free Syria Army combat brigades or battalions. That's about 50 to 100 guys per battalion, or nearly 9,000 men under arms. There have been some 23 new battalions that have appeared since February alone, which suggests a momentum in the defections. Only 2 of these units, the best we can tell so far, from YouTube, and I think this is actually an incredible resource, are self-defined as Islamist. Right? So by and large, you have these units who are identifying themselves as Free Syria Army. They are operating in 7 of 14 provinces, including Aleppo and Latakia. They're attacking government checkpoints, facilities, barracks, police stations, lines of communication. They're coordinating to protect demonstrations. How to judge whether they've been effective or not? I think you can see that there's an evolving set of tactics of the regime in response to the Free Syria Army. I think that's the sign of how effective the Free Syria Army has been. Assad's troops no longer enter cities by themselves. After being engaged by the Free Syria Army, they then started coming with armored columns, but they can't do that anymore either because of the capabilities of the Free Syrian Army. They have anti-tank weapons, and so you have what we're seeing now in Homs and Idlib, which is the mass shelling of the cities from outside of cities. And also the use of helicopters and likely soon fixed-wing aircraft. I think that's due to the nature of the Free Syrian Army and the threat it poses. The regime has not deployed chemical biological weapons yet, but there have been some reports of a psychedelic agent called BZ being deployed in Homs. We have lots of attrition of regime forces between the defections and the reported executions of soldiers who are refusing to follow orders. There are some indications that Saudi and Qatar are supporting the Free Syrian Army. Turkey is still somewhat on the fence. Rhetorically, they're there. They're providing sanctuary to some leaders of the Free Syria Army and reportedly turning a blind eye to some weapons moving in, but themselves not providing weapons, the best we can tell. The Free Syria Army needs assistance. Bullets apparently cost some $4 each in Syria. According to U.S. military sources, bullets are becoming more expensive in Lebanon as well, not surprisingly. In addition to ammunition, the Free Syria Army needs better command structure. We could talk how to get there. These units and battalions are showing some more discipline and ingenuity, but they are still largely franchise operations that are operating independently. In order to establish better command and control, they need better secure communications equipment, perhaps body armor, RPGs, RPG-29 anti-tank weapons, Metis M anti-tank weapons, 81 millimeter mortars, things they can put on the back of a truck. This is, I think, a trend that's not going to go away here. The Free Syria Army is a growing factor. This may degenerate into civil war. This may degenerate into something like Algeria, and I'm not referring to Algeria in the early 90s where the FIS was driving around with Ford 150 trucks of mobile guillotines on the back, chopping off the heads of non-believers. I'm talking about, sorry for the digression there, but I'm talking about really that the government in Algeria, Bouteflika, can only control certain areas of the country, and there are certain areas of the country that are beyond regime control. These are open spaces where if the regime goes, they will be targeted. And I think that's what you're going to see over time in Syria, particularly as more parties intervene from the outside. The goal, and this may be out of the purview of the political role of the military, but we're seeing now another military in Syria. The goal is to really degrade the capabilities over time of the regime, to bankrupt the regime, deplete the supplies of the regime. In DIA, Defense Intelligence, they talk about the Syrian army eating tanks. And what do they mean about eating tanks? They mean that basically that Syria, like so many other Arab armies, they don't change the oil in their trucks. They don't do basic maintenance on equipment, and it breaks down, and they go out and buy another tank. Right? It's harder to buy another tank these days, though. The army was established really to fight a short war against Israel, a short, intense war against Israel. And you've now had a year with very few units being responsible for playing whack-a-mole throughout Syria. This is going to continue, and I think that some of these Alawite units are going to get degraded. You don't have a political endgame here. You have the Syrian National Council, which is largely an exile political group that is divided. The only thing they hate more than Assad is each other. And they're also being pulled apart by I think, outside actors. In particular, if you watch Al Jazeera, you'll see interviews with some leaders of the Syrian National Council who are being interviewed from Paris, Borhan Ghalioun, and women who are very modern, secular, and then they will interview leadership of this political entity from Ankara, where they have beards and talk about the future Islamic nature of Syria. So I think that Turkey is working at cross purposes, at least politically, from what we'd like to see in the end. In any event, this organization is not credible on the ground, is not coordinating, and the military leadership of the Free Syria Army has no desire to subjugate itself to this ineffective, quarreling organization. I think from where I stand, what needs to be done is to improve the political structure, but we can't count on that. I think we have to work with the people who have the guns on the ground. Because in the end, if we lead behind and let the Qataris and the Saudis lead from out front, these are less, let's say, discerning entities. They are not going to be concerned necessarily who gets the weapons as much as we will be. What's more is, if the Free Syria Army is not unified, you risk having a situation very much like Libya, where today you have some 300-odd militias who are refusing to disarm to a central government. It would be better to have one central authority, and if you feed weapons and command and control through a central point in Syria, perhaps you can generate some loyalty and some fealty to a central command of the Free Syrian Army. I would argue, just in conclusion, that we don't know how this is going to come out, but that given the nature of the Assad regime, they're oftentimes discussed in terms of the devil we know, but we know an awful lot about this devil, not only what it's done at home, but what it's done to its neighbors, and in particular to the United States, responsible for the death of hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans in Iraq. I would say that even a Muslim Brotherhood regime, where there's no indication it's moving toward that direction, but I think if you look around at all the neighbors, this is what you're going to have ultimately in Syria too, regrettably. Even a Muslim Brotherhood regime in Syria that is inimical to the United States and doesn't like Israel very much would still be in U.S. interests more than the current Assad regime. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate all of you sticking to the timetable, and especially since we started late. So I would like to open it up for discussion, and I'll go directly to the audience. And I know that some of you might want to engage each other, obviously, particularly because of the comparison from state to state. But we can start by taking some questions from the audience, and then perhaps we can ask each one of the panelists to answer. If you don't mind identifying yourself when you ask that question, and if you have a targeted question specifically to one of the panelists, please say so. Go ahead.
Paul Sham from the Gildenhorn Institute. First, thanks to all of you for an incredibly informative session. I think we all got lots of insight. I'd like to direct a question to Jillian. What is the current attitude of the upper echelons of the Jordanian army towards Israel? It's, as you emphasize, the regime is stable. There's no reason to believe otherwise. But the army has generally had good relations with Israel in intelligence and otherwise. In the current situation with the king somewhat displeased at the Israeli government, is there any change in that sort of cooperation? Are they seeing Israel differently, or hasn't that really affected them?
I can't answer that, I'm afraid. It's a great question. I mean, as I said, I apologize not coming at this as an expert on the military per se, but I bet people in here probably have some other thoughts on that. But I mean, I could speculate, but I don't know, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
If I may say, if I understood your question about the attitude of the upper echelons of the military toward Israel, I mean, if you look actually at what happened in the relationship between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan after the peace treaties, and even before to some extent, the Israelis have primarily focused actually on consolidation with military institutions for security cooperation. And that certainly has been both with Egypt and with Jordan. And the relations are cooperative, effective, often, daily, I think, on both fronts. And even after the revolution, in the case of Egypt, as you know, if you ask the military leaders in Israel, whether it's Barak or his deputy, about the state of the relationship between the Egyptian military and the Israeli military today, they tell you it's the strongest it's ever been. They don't think the military has as much influence as it did before in Egypt, but they think the benefits of that consolidation of relationship before is manifesting itself. It's not a coincidence that the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel that was just brokered took place by the Egyptian military, which had an interest in that, and the U.S. was not in a position to do that kind of mediation. Obviously, the military does. I think in Jordan you have something similar, although obviously with a lot more complexity because of what Jillian talked about, but there is definitely a cooperative relationship.
Yeah, Paul, I would add, if I can, I think as the regime, well, the military, as the regime is under increased pressure for not only in the sort of the Arab Spring environment, but this sort of broad perspective in the state that the Palestinians are getting too many goodies at the expense of the East Bankers. The East Bankers who run the military look to Israel as an ally against the Palestinians. The intelligence control cooperation, the military-to-military cooperation is as strong as ever, if not stronger. And I think that there's really a concern, that things could go the wrong way in the kingdom, and that they would hope that Israel would look to secure, provide assistance, any way to help insulate the regime.
Yes.
My name is Al Klein.
Get a microphone so that it can be heard a little better.
My name is Al Klein, and I'm a Goldenite Eastern, otherwise known as the Philippines, not at all. I'd like to ask Professor Barkey to continue on with the issue of the relations with Israel, relations between Israel.
Try the other microphone, I think is not working.
I'd like to ask Professor Barkey to continue on with the theme of the relations with Israel, in this case in Turkey. Many conflicting reports. I'd like to hear what Professor Barkey has to say about the current situation of the Turkish military with Israel.
In the 1990s, the Turkish military and, Turkey and Israel went through a period of great cooperation. I mean, some people have called it a strategic alliance. I never saw it as a strategic alliance. It was certainly cooperation that both countries needed. The Turks wanted to put pressure on the Syrians. They wanted certain arms from the Israelis that they couldn't get elsewhere. And the Israelis were interested in, obviously, not only selling arms, but also access to the Turkish airspace in order to do training. And it was part of the Israeli grander strategy of the periphery strategy of Ben-Gurion that goes back essentially to the founding of the state, as if you make friends with all the neighboring countries, all the countries that are on the periphery of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the important thing about that relationship was that it was never supported by the Turkish public. In fact, the Turkish public did not like this deal, and it was imposed by the military or by fiat. And as a result, there was a great deal of unhappiness with it, even though it did pay off certain dividends in 1998 when the Turks kind of threatened the Syrians about the presence of the Kurdish insurgent leader in Damascus and said, you had to kick him out, and Father Assad did kick him out, and it was because the Arab world perceived essentially a pincer movement between Israel and Turkey. So it paid off dividends for the Turks. But with the decline of the military in Turkey, there is really no constituency in Turkey for that relationship. And between the Gaza operation of 2008, the current Prime Minister Erdogan's unhappiness with the Israelis because Olmert was in Ankara just a few days before the operation and didn't tell him about it, that Erdogan was really insulted by it. But of course, then there's the Mavi Marmara flotilla incident that essentially broke all relations with Israel. They're not going to get any better anytime soon. The antipathy for Israel in Turkey is enormous. I joke by saying that there is more debate in Turkey about the Armenian genocide than there is about Israel in terms of, so there's, I can say 100% unanimity on opposition to Israel in all forms and fashions. And even if the Israelis were to apologize and pay compensation, not that they're likely to do anytime soon, it will never, never, never go back.
Joe Gildenhorn, chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. If Israel should strike Iran, what would be the situation in Syria? Are they too busy with the insurrection, or would they possibly attack Israel?
Well, that's a good question. I actually had an article that was published this morning by the Washington Institute on how Hezbollah would respond to a strike on Iran. Syria, I think, is not in a position to do anything. The question really, as the uprising goes on, is what the ultimate disposition of the WMD will be in Syria, whether these 40 or 50 sites can be secured by whom, and whether there will be any leakage, whether to Hezbollah or to anybody, or whether the regime itself would provoke something with Israel in order to have a rally around the flag effect to save its own skin. It's not clear to me that Hezbollah itself will necessarily respond to an Israeli or an American attack on Iran. Syria, I don't think the regime's in a position to go out and defend Iran. Iran can defend itself. Thank you. But yeah, I don't know.
Go ahead, Alma.
I'm Alma Gildenhorn. I'm a trustee of the Aspen Institute. Getting back to Syria, there is widespread belief that all of the generals would defect. But from the latest reports that I've heard, that in Syria, that the military around Assad is stronger than ever. Would you comment on that, and that there has been actually no defection whatsoever? Lesser officers have defected, but not his inner circle, stronger than ever.
Yeah, well, I think that's true, that his inner circle has not. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. There was a rumor that the defection that occurred last week, in which some 4 generals went to Turkey, was actually a foiled coup attempt. I don't know, whether there's any veracity to those reports. The fact of the matter, though, is that we're looking at a situation here where 75% of the country is basically, being targeted by 11% of the country. The Alawites were, at one time, certainly many Sunnis view them as infidels, but they were at one point as well sort of the lowest of the social caste in Syria. Like if you were a Sunni middle-class person living in Damascus, you would have an Alawite girl who mopped your floors. The Alawites know, and the longer this goes on in particular, that there will be retribution if the regime falls. They're I don't know if they call them pogroms or certainly a lot of retribution against this community, as well as the Christians, by the way, because the Christians are still allied with the Alawites. But the officer corps, the highest echelons, are Alawite. This is a community that knows what lay in store for them. My guess in the end, I could be wrong, is that Assad will be Gaddafi'd. He's not going to, go to, Iran or Russia if he can help it, because he knows that he, as a representative of his religious community, that, what lay in store for them. This is, maybe it's projection of how they're treating everybody else, but they're going to fight to the end. And so I'm not surprised that senior Alawite military officers are not defecting. They may decide that Assad's not their guy anymore, but it doesn't mean they're going to call it quits. They may get rid of Assad and find somebody else. But if you have a coup, it doesn't mean that the Sunnis are going to take control of the country, because the Sunnis are not that, at the top of the pinnacle in the military.
If I may, just on the issue of a possible Syrian role if Israel were to attack Iran, it can't be separated from the issue of what Hezbollah will do, because the talk has been primarily on Syria, and obviously Hezbollah has an investment in the current regime in Syria, and the regime has an investment in Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been very careful to say that they will not, quote, automatically respond if Israel attacks Iran, that their decision is not tied to that, but they will then sit down and think, and they will, in part that was a reassurance to the Lebanese allies and opponents to say that, we're not playing into a war here by being allies of Iran. In a public opinion poll that I released 2 weeks ago in Israel itself, you have 3/4 of Israelis who believe that if Israel does attack Iran, Hezbollah will join in. So the Israeli public expectation, whether it's the security establishment assessment or not, is not clear, but certainly the Israeli public assessment is that Hezbollah would join, in fact, if there was a war with Iran. And there is also assessment of whether, in fact, Israel would feel that if it's going to go to war with Iran, it'd rather preempt a Hezbollah counterattack by attacking them first. So the fact of this issue of Hezbollah is tied very closely to the Iran case. If Hezbollah does join, then Israel is going to go all out in its confrontation with Hezbollah. What Syria will do in that environment is anybody's guess, but I would have to say that there would be a better than 50-50 chance that they'll be drawn in. So I wouldn't exclude that at all as a possibility, even as they're entangled, because in part their biggest case to the Arab public and to their own citizens, and the case that Hezbollah is making on their behalf, is that they're being weakened because they're strongly standing up for Israel. This is an Israeli-led conspiracy against them, in the opposition. It's not selling in the Arab world, obviously. Public opinion polls that I conduct in the Arab world show that 90% of the Arab public supports the rebels against the government, although they don't want to see international intervention in Syria. But I want to do a little bit of a disagreement with David on what are the consequences. Obviously, right now, this bloodshed and killing has to stop. No one is defending the regime, or, I don't see how anybody could make an argument that people who are killing thousands of people can be defended in any shape or form. But if you're making a strategic assessment about what the consequences will be when and if they're overthrown, I would not go to the extent of agreeing with David that, quote, it will be better for Israel or the United States. I don't know whether it could be better, but I would, if I had to make a guess, I would say that Syria will be highly unstable, that it is probable that al-Qaeda-supported groups will take hold there, particularly given the relationship that is emerging now with al-Qaeda in Iraq in there. And that while that's not the instinct of the Syrian people, the Syrians are, divided. They want to, but they all want to build and move forward. And there is a traditional Muslim Brotherhood trend, and there is a secular trend as well in segments of the Syrian public I think just the lack of central authority, particularly if you go into arming the rebels and then what is going to amount to a more extensive civil war, at least until the issue is settled, will be fragmentation of instability for a long time. We don't know how long. And that is not a stabilizing factor on our borders in any shape or form. I mean, whatever you say about the relationship between Syria and Egypt rhetorically or even in terms of the tension and the Hezbollah factor, the borders have been relatively quiet for a long and predictable. And the sense of strategic interest predictable. Again, this is not an argument to defend the regime. It is an argument about the consequences. And so I would not in any shape or form jump to the conclusion that anything is better.
Hi, I'm Boaz Atzili from American University. My question is basically to all of you. You, for good reason, you concentrated on the role of the military internally because of the Arab Spring and all of what's going on in the Middle East. But my question is if you can talk a little bit about, in all three countries, what is currently the role of the military in determining external relations and making kind of its position on strategic relations outside of the country in Syria, Jordan, and Turkey.
You just go ahead, whoever wants to start.
It used to be that the Turkish military decided what the strategic relationship would be. They were the ones who would write the main kind of our equivalent of the national security doctrine. But that has been taken away from them. And not only taken away from them, but changed radically by this government. And even on the relationship between, let's say, Turkey and its main ally, the United States, the military played a very, very important role. And we also encouraged it in many ways. I mean, when we found that Turkish politicians were difficult to deal with, we would essentially talk to the military and ask them to do our business for them, and without even consulting the Turkish civilians. So, but that has changed. I mean, they are no longer a factor. I mean, they are very much now de facto, but not de jure, under civilian control. Plus, they are now so much worried about their own position in society and with the trials that are going on, that I don't think they really... The one issue where they have an important role still to play is the Kurdish insurgency. But that's a domestic and not an international stuff.
My sense is that the army in Jordan doesn't seem to be at odds in any way with the regime in terms of external relations, in terms of strong relations with Israel and certainly with the United States. There's, a large number of joint exercises that take place. And so I don't see it as pushing the regime in any different kind of way than where the regime's commitments are. I'd be interested if other people know otherwise, but I don't see it in any way as not in line with the king's agenda.
I see the military as an extension of the regime. I mean, this is basically whatever the Alawites think is best for their security and remaining in power is what, the guidance will come from Assad, from the regime, and the military will go along with it, provided they're not called upon to fight any external wars. They don't want that. They want, sort of being able to do business, being able to make money, getting a paycheck, and having this sort of doctrine of deterrence, having their WMD and not having to go to war with Israel. I think that's what they want.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, Sandra Sham, I'm with USAID, and I wanted to ask Professor Barkey a question that probably won't touch on Israel at all. But I worked over a series of 3 summers in southeastern Turkey in the Hatay region, and one thing two things that struck me about my work there, is that the region essentially has very strong Syrian connections, even after this 8 decades.
Which region? Hatay?
Hatay. And secondly, that Turks are very preoccupied with the protection of their borders. So I'm wondering, with the Syrian situation being what it is, if what is happening in southeastern Turkey would strengthen the military or would have an opposite effect?
Well, when people refer to southeastern Turkey, they don't usually put Hatay in that area. Southeastern Turkey is further east and refers to the Kurdish areas. Hatay, or Alexandretta, as the Syrians or other people would know it by, used to be Syrian territory that the Turks took over in 1939. So it still has, as you said, very strong relationships with Syria, with Aleppo in particular. And this is the only place in Turkey where there's been actually a great deal of unhappiness with the government's policy with respect to Syria, i.e. the shift from supporting Assad to actual opposition to Assad. And it's partially economic related because trade between Syria and Turkey has deteriorated a great deal, even though it would have deteriorated because of the conflict in Syria, not because of any Turkish government action, but nonetheless people there see it as the result of government action. Second, there are a lot of Turkish Alevis who live in Hatay, who are, shall we say, cousins of the Alawites, plus there are Arab Alawites who live in Hatay. So Hatay is, in that sense, different as a province than the rest of the southeast. And the issue for the Turks in the Syrian conflict is not, again, Hatay, unless, I should say one more thing, that the Syrians when the relations between Turkey and Syria improved after the AKP came to power, the Syrians gave up their claim on Hatay or Alexandretta. They used to claim that territory, and all their maps would show that. I think Assad is probably going to reclaim that now if he survives. So, is there a worry that a new regime will that claim will come up again? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the Turks are really worried. I mean, I think the Turks are far too strong compared to the Syrians. The big worry for them is actually what happens to the Kurds in Syria, whether or not the Kurds in Syria succeed in doing what the Iraqi Kurds did, which is to carve out for themselves some kind of de facto or de jure autonomous region. And that will have, now you'll have 2 of the 4 Kurdish areas among the 4 countries having autonomy, and that will have, in the Turkish mind, a great deal of impact on Turkish Kurds, who are already asking for similar things, at least some of them do.
Yes, over here, and then Madeline.
My name is Derek Boyd. As most of the militaries in this area are dependent for equipment and training on foreign countries, I'm interested in your understanding of how these foreign suppliers, if you like, determine the future of the military. In other words, they presumably can exert pressure on the military through these channels that they have to the military, and how this affects the military in these countries and the internal politics of those countries.
Anyone wants to take that?
I mean, there's 2 countries in particular that all 3 I can say one thing about very, very quickly. Right now everybody's looking toward Russia, right, in terms of Syria, about whether they'll continue to supply the Syrian military. The Russians have a lot going on, not least of which is that they got bamboozled on the Libya resolution in 1973, which was humanitarian and was used to get the proverbial camel's nose under the tent to end the Libyan regime by going beyond the terms of the resolution. The Russians have a lot of assets invested in Syria. It is their last remaining Arab ally. And it's not only that they have, $4 or $5 billion of arms sales to Syria. they lost $4 billion to Libya. But that this is the training of their Middle East Mukhabarat hub, where they do all their intel. So they have a lot of concern about what happens ultimately. 3 weeks ago or a month ago, after the Russians and the Chinese vetoed the resolution, the demonstration, they have names for every Friday demonstration in all these countries, but in Syria, the name of the demonstration was the Friday of the Russians are killing our babies. So moving forward, whether this will amount to a policy change in a post-Assad Syria, whether they will decide that it's worth their while to change their standardization from, Russian equipment to Western equipment. It's very expensive to do so. Even if they hate Russia, I don't know if they're going to do that. But they have a lot of concerns, and they have leverage as well, because they can really dramatically complicate matters for us in getting out of Afghanistan, for example. And just the two other states, really briefly, you guys can answer. But in Jordan, it is a perennial debtor state. Jordan has never turned a profit or been solvent since it was founded. They depend on the United States entirely for all their procurement. It's $300 million a year in FMF plus supplementals typically. And for that, they provide a very useful service to us. In the case of Iraq, helping us to land planes and take off planes to bomb Iraq, and maybe moving forward and helping to arm the Syrian rebels. We shall see. They're very happy with the military-to-military relationship, and they get a lot for it. Turkey, I think, the nature of the relationship is going to change dramatically moving forward. Turkey is a member of NATO. They're entitled to certain equipment based on their membership in NATO. In 2014, Turkey was, up for getting the Joint Strike Fighter, the next generation, U.S. fighter plane that has all the bells and whistles and has our technology for, generations going forward. I don't think that Congress will approve the sale of the Joint Strike Fighter to Turkey. And that Turkey may make matters easier for the United States by not asking for it. But if they do ask for it, I don't think we're going to sell it to them. If you look what happened, based on, the Joint Anatolian Eagle, for example, a year ago, where Turkey excluded Israel from the operation, from the joint training, and instead invited China to participate. And China, landed its planes in Iran to refuel, and then flew to Turkey, where they trained with, Turkish-produced F-16s. I don't think that Congress is going to look, kindly on selling our next great technology to Turkey.
I would add briefly, just in terms of the domestic perception of the foreign training, I found it very curious that I found a great number of complaints about the foreign arming and training, and basically the perception is that the Dadak forces were created by, and completely foreign funded and plopped down in Jordan to be this repressive apparatus, when the army has all kinds of military exercises with the United States, and they're highly publicized in the Arabic press, and they're celebrated, and yet people don't complain about that. And so they both have, foreign training, but on one side it's seen as, this horrible thing that's happening. On the other side, it's, wow, great, look at this great connection. So it's curious in terms of its effect. The fact of foreign training doesn't automatically translate to the same thing domestically in terms of perception.
Your question essentially has two components in some ways. I mean, does the supplier have influence over the military as an institution, or does also supplier have influence on the government? On the Turkish military, the United States, as being the sole provider of choice, had, but not, I would not say extensive influence. That is to say that the Turkish military and the Turks in general have always assumed that Turkey was more important to the United States than people gave credit, and that we would essentially go along with their choices. And to some extent, that's true. Where the influence has come through in terms of the military as an institution is putting the brakes on coups. I think the Turkish military would have been far more involved in domestic politics had it not been for U.S. Influence. And in fact, after the AKP came to power in 2002, and when I know for a fact that some of the generals who are now in prison were trying to come to the United States to visit the Pentagon, and then they would come back and say, the United States gave us a green light to coup, and the U.S. essentially prevented them from doing that. But the NATO alliance is still very significant, and the Turks, especially now with the Arab Spring, realize that NATO is far more important as an anchor, and that's why they essentially agreed also to the radar system that they were really against, and placed it in eastern Turkey. So I disagree with David in terms of going forward in terms of that relationship. The Joint Strike Fighter, the Turks have actually already contributed to the development of it, and the delivery is way down the road. Things will change by then, I suspect.
Well, we'll take the last question from Madeline Zulfi.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Professor Barkey a question, and it in some ways ties in with many of the comments that you all have just been making with regard to the Turkish military. The way in which you describe the Turkish military has them as sort of decapitated in some ways. It also paints a picture of them as kind of passive during their preoccupation with the trials and so on. The AK party, however, is a very activist kind of party. Clearly, given these NATO kinds of connections in terms of Turkey's own sense of its own prestige and the leverage it gets by being a member of NATO, you can't just let the military sit there. So what is the AK party actually doing to reconstitute the military?
It's an excellent question. I mean, the way the relationship has changed and the attitude of the AKP towards the military has changed. I don't know if you remember, but in The Best and the Brightest, Halberstam's great book, at one point Johnson is asked about helicopters, and he says, "Son, they're all my helicopters," talking about all the helicopters the United States has. And I think Erdogan's approach is they're all my generals. Right? Now he sees the military differently. In fact, he has now that the military has been decapitated, as you said, now he's looking at the military as much more as an instrument and something that is under his control. And in fact, when the military really messed up at the end of December, when they bombed smugglers and they killed 35 kids, and he actually went and protected them. I mean, it was a major disaster from a military perspective, but he essentially defended them. And now what he's doing is he's essentially providing the military with the toys and the goodies that they want, right? But at the same time making sure that they don't get involved in politics. So we are in a period of a transition period whereby he's going to try to, and the next thing will be to if there's a new constitution, to put the military under the jure civilian control, i.e. under the Ministry of Defense. So all of these things are going to happen, but he's not undermining the military's professional part of the institution, i.e. Training and in fact they're also spending a lot more money in terms of not only acquisition but domestic acquisition, creating a domestic defense industry. They're putting a lot of money into that. And the other rumor that came out the other day is that maybe they're thinking about getting an aircraft carrier. Go figure.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for an informative discussion.